Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Tank Talk podcast. Lots of things have been happening over the last few weeks, and I am very glad to be back. Thank you, Jason, for holding down the fort last week when I was under the weather and unable to show up the day of recording. You did a great job on that episode. Today's episode, now that I'm back, it's time to get serious again. It's time to go all in and bring the people the episode that they've been waiting for. I don't know if you've been looking in the comments, but I've been looking in the comments and seeing people asking, where is... Tell everybody what they're waiting for.
African Cichlids Part 2. Yes, many of you asked for it. We promised it probably a month ago, maybe longer. We said, well, we're running out of time. We got to do a Part 2. And that is exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to do Part 2, African Cichlids. Today, what are we focusing on?
My favorites. Not my favorites. I love them. I love them so much, but they're not my favorites anymore. Peacocks and haps. I love them equally to Mbunas. That first episode we didn't do this on purpose. It just kind of naturally happened. We focused almost the entire episode on Mbunas. Today, we're going to start over again, and we're going to talk about peacocks and haps, the big dogs in the African cichlid world.
And before we get started, thank you so much to Fritz Aquatics. Fritz Aquatics is sponsoring this episode. We partner with them because we love them. They have some of the best aquarium chemicals and additives for your aquarium that you can possibly imagine, not to mention all the really, really good meds. They've got the Fix Ick, and they've got all kinds of stuff, the Maricin 1 and 2s, the Expel Ps, and the Paracleanse. Really, really good stuff. So if you haven't checked them out, check out Fritz Aquatics, which you can find on
keepfishkeeping.com. I know the guy that owns that website too. He's a good guy and he's married to a beautiful woman. They will send you out all of your Fritz supplies right away. Very good customer service at that company.
All very true. So how do you want to start this? Because last time, it's been so long, I don't remember where we left off with our conversation. I know we completed the conversation on Mbuna, but we didn't really even, I don't think, started getting into the meat of the peacocks and haps. So do we just want to assume that we're going to start it from the beginning?
Yeah, I think we should. With Mbunas, and the reason why it took the entire episode was because we went pretty deep with those fish. I mean, we talked about their origins and setting up an appropriate tank for them, tank size, water parameters, breeding them. We talked about all of them, mixing them. And I think we should do the same thing with peacocks and haps. We can lump them together. There are people that would argue, the best case scenario is to have them separated, but I'm not one of those people. I think you can mix them perfectly. And the setup for these fish is going to be not night and day different, not black and white, but if you're going to set it up perfect world scenario, it's going to be a little different than what you would do for Mbunas. So I think we start all over again. We start with, the general setup for peacocks and haps, or if you want to talk about their origins. I mean, I don't know how much time.
I keep the Mbunas. I've kept them for years, decades and decades, and I've kept a lot of peacocks and some haps, but I think it would be beneficial. Can you start just by giving either some examples or what is the difference? Because I lump them in together. I don't recognize that much of a difference between the two. I think you do more than I do. So what would you say are there special differences between peacocks and haps that people need to be aware of?
There are, but there also isn't. It's almost like there are some haps that you can mistake for peacocks, but most people that are in this hobby for any particular length of time that enjoy African cichlids will be able to tell the difference right away. Oh no, that's not a peacock, that's a red empress, even though it looks similar to a peacock. But generally, peacocks are, for the most part, all going to have the same kind of arrowhead shape. It is one of the most sought after shapes in the hobby as far as the shape of their body, their finnage, all of that kind of stuff. But most of the peacocks are going to have pretty much the same shape to them. The difference is going to be in their colors. There are a few standouts. Eureka Red Jake would be the first one that jumps out that depending on who you buy them from and depending on where the originals were collected, what part of the lake they were collected from, the shape can be a little bit different, but it's not going to fool you into believing that it's a hap or something like that. But for the most part, for the purposes of this conversation, we will talk about peacocks as if they're all pretty much the same as far as their general shape goes. The haps, and with that shape, you're going to be full grown when they're fully mature and really at their largest, 4 to 6 inches is going to be your peacocks. If you get a 6-inch peacock, you got a big fella. Like that's a big one. Most of them are going to be in that 4-inch range. The males are going to be a little bit bigger. Some of them substantially bigger than the females. But these are not huge fish. When you get into haps, that's where everything changes, because haps not only are very different from peacocks, but they're different. Each hap is different from the next. All different shapes and sizes. Some of them are tall and fat. Some of them are long and skinny. Some haps can get up to 15 inches in size. So there's a vast difference between all of the haps, whereas the peacocks, you can spot a peacock from a mile away. You know that shape. It is an iconic shape, and it stands out. Just a silhouette of a peacock, that's a peacock. Whereas a hap, it's like, oh, that could be a lot of things. But I don't mean to say that as if to say they're not special. That I love haps because I love the variety of them, and some of them are big, some of them are small. Their colors are unbelievable. I hope that narrows down what you were getting at there, the differences between them and what we're talking about here. We're talking about good sized fish and big fish.
If you were to give, let's say, 3 examples of each, right? Whether it's common names or species, what would be 3 examples of peacocks and 3 examples of haps?
I'll go based on popularity. I think the most popular peacock is probably going to be the sunshine. Some of them call them bangas, yellow bangas. This is going to be a predominantly yellow fish with some blue highlights on the fins and the blue face on the male. Now, let me preface all of this by saying something I should have said in the very beginning. Where these differ the most from imbunas, first of all, their size and their shape is very different from imbunas, but imbunas, like if you have a yellow lab, a group of yellow labs, and you're looking at them from a distance, you're not really going to know the difference. You're not going to be able to tell which ones are males and which ones are females. There are differences, but they look basically the same, unless we're talking about certain ones where the males are yellow and the females are blue and stuff like that. Peacocks and haps are not that way. The females they're just like birds. The females are the drabby colored, gray, sometimes silver, brown, where the males are the ones that show the bright colors. So whenever we're talking about a brightly colored sunshine peacock, we're talking about the males there. Unfortunately, the females get the short end of the stick. They're still beautiful fish, but not nearly as attractive or sought after as the males. So the sunshine, my next one that I would give, I'm trying to not give my favorites. I'm trying to look at them
just examples. It doesn't matter.
Well, my next favorite one would be the lemon jake peacock, which is primarily a blue fish with yellow highlights, so kind of the reverse of the sunshine. And I wasn't saying the sunshine's my favorite. My favorite would actually be the red top lawanda, which there's a lot of variations of that fish. It all depends on who you get it from. Some of them have a little purple in them, but they're primarily, again, blue and yellow, which is the color combination of most fish from most African cichlids. It's going to be that blue, yellow, sometimes a little bit of red, orange. But those are 3 great examples. But then you also have the German blues, the German reds, which would be the primarily red fish with blue face. The OBs, which are a hybrid created by my friend Rick Biro, that is multiple fish combined to give you a splotchy pattern. OB, Peacock's OB stands for orange blotch. They're very sought after, have a reputation of being mean. But then when we move to haps, the probably most popular hap would be either the Red Empress, which is the one peacock that the one hap that kind of resembles a peacock but much larger, primarily red with the blue face. The Ali, the electric blue Ali, which you're going to find in almost every pet store because it's a gorgeous, longer, more slender, longer, bright blue fish with white highlights on the fins. Absolutely striking. And then the king of most hap tanks, the Venustus. Got a very special place in my heart, the Venustus. I love this fish. It has, do you call it like leopard spots? I feel like leopard spots would be more like the Livingstone eye, but I'm looking at one right now, a gorgeous version of one. Very large. These can get up to like 10 inches in size, primarily yellow with big brown spots, and the males are going to have a blue face. I'm going to try, Jason, to put up examples while we're talking for our video viewers, examples of these fish, so that people can reference that. But those would probably be, I don't know if they're the most popular. The Taiwan Reef would probably be a high up on the list of popularity. It all depends on who you talk to as far as what the most popular are. But those are some good examples of some common ones that you'll see in almost every pet store.
Yeah, a couple of my favorites for the haps. White Knight Ali had a group of those, and when I actually had them in with some Mbuna, some Solosai, rusty cichlids. It was a great mix. People constantly were asking, what is that white fish? Because it had a little bit of blue iridescence. Yes. White Knight Alis, and then the Lethrinops intermedius. I had one of those that was probably 8 inches, and it was the king of the tank. Gorgeous fish. I don't even know how to explain the colors. It's like almost like a rusty. It's like a rust color with some green and some blue, and it's like all of those colors all at once, and they're insanely beautiful fish. Big fish, though. But like you said, the one thing with the peacocks and the haps that people have to be aware of is we're talking about the males. We're talking about all these striking colors. We're talking about the males. The females, they're just going to be brown or silver or tan, and that is absolutely something you have to keep in mind if you're going to be keeping these fish, because the females are not going to be much to look at.
It's true. Some of them, again, more attractive than others, but the Lethrinops intermedius is a great example. The females of those, nothing like the males. I agree with you. The Lethrinops intermedius, I hate calling fish specimens. I don't know if you do. I don't know why. It just bothers me when I hear people call them specimens. We're not doing a science experiment. This is a fish. But when you get a fully colored up Lethrinops intermedius, I don't know that there's a prettier fish on the planet than that. I mean, they are unbelievable. The females, not so much, but they're still an attractive looking fish. You could have a tank full of female Lethrinops intermedius, because there's a lot of different Lethrinops, and it's a nice looking tank. But the males, oh, good grief. But the females, this is where, when we had the conversation about Mbunas, you can get away with females as long as you don't mind the breeding part, because they will do it. The one of the biggest difference with peacocks and haps is not just the sizes compared to Mbunas, but also the differences in the males and the females. And because of that, there's going to be a vast difference in price if you're buying a colored up male versus the females. It's unfortunate, but it's part of the deal. And you're not going to see that as much with Mbunas.
It's 100% true. So keep in mind, if you are looking at a peacock or a hap tank or a combination, you can spend not almost no money, but relatively speaking, when I would go to the fish clubs, you could get, especially through their BAP programs, like, hey, I just bred, here's 8 less than 1 inch or 1 inch fish in a bag. It could be any peacock, any hap. And generally speaking, that group of 6 to 8 are going to go less than $10 at a fish swap, okay, or at a meeting. At a pet store, at least in my area, and you can speak to your area and see, if it's any different, but in our area, if you're getting a sub a juvenile. If you're getting a juvenile Mbuna, I'm sorry, a juvenile peacock or hap, maybe $20, 20 $25 if they're not colored up yet. But you start introducing color, those fish can go $40 to $60 in our area all
Easily.
day long. Now, swaps, much less. Swaps, you can get a colored up male for 20 $25, but at a pet store, they get really expensive real fast because now you've got the males. And then the sad part is the ones that are basically full size, but they have no color, are the females, and they're worthless unless someone's
Yep.
trying to breed.
It's sad to say that, but it's so true. I mean, that when you say they're worthless, and I hate saying that, but
Yeah.
you know, if you've ever been into a fish store that has a large selection of African cichlids, it's not uncommon, particularly peacocks and haps, to find a tank that's all females, because one of the interesting dynamics with these fish is that there's always going to be a dominant male in the tank. And that dominant male is going to have the brightest colors. It's going to stand out from all of them. This is the alpha. This is the guy that's in charge of all of the fish in that tank. As soon as you take him out, another one's going to take charge and brightly color up like that. And so that's the next one to sell. And they pull that one out, and then you end up going through all of the males and you're left with nothing but females. I can tell you this, don't tell them I told you this, but most fish stores will unload those females on you for next to nothing, because I'm sorry to say it this way, nobody wants them. And you're doing the store a favor to buy those females. And a lot of farms actually force the stores to buy females. Like, they'll only sell in pairs, a male and a female. And the reason why is because if you're a breeder, and I was one and I ran into this problem, you can get overrun with females.
Yeah.
And that's the sad part of this business, but it happens. So yeah, I don't know what made me go off on that tangent. I'm sorry.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think before we get too far, because I do want to talk more about breeding and breeding setups a little bit later. But before we get into that, it's probably a good idea just to remind people water parameters for these fish are not all that different than the Mbuna. And by the way, if you haven't seen that episode where we talked about Mbuna, check that video out. Hopefully we can link it down in the description below. But that was a really good conversation about Mbuna. But the peacocks and the haps also come from Lake Malawi, just like the Mbuna do. So the water parameters are going to be very similar. You're in really good shape if you've got a pH somewhere near 8. You're in really good shape if you've got harder water. So your GH and KH, somewhere around 10 or higher on your, in terms of degrees. So you're going to be more than adequate there. They can go certainly higher than that. And normal tropical fish temperatures, I like to keep mine, I don't know about you, but I used to keep mine right around 78 or 80, and they were really comfortable there. The one thing I loved about them is when you have those water parameters, they are usually very, very hardy, and they're going to live a really long time for you. And the males will show all of that potential color.
They definitely will, especially if there are females present. I mean, and that's something that not a lot of people talk about. Almost everybody that's in this hobby, unless you're trying to breed them, they're after the all male tank because they're the ones with the most color. But I would argue, even though a tank full of male peacocks and haps is a gorgeous tank with a lot of color and it's beautiful, I would argue that if there were a few females present, the colors would be even more, because they're trying to impress those females. And that happens. It's Mother Nature at her finest. So, but you almost everyone is after that all male tank. And it's the sad part of the business, but it's true.
So what direction do you want to take it? Do we want to talk about how to set up a tank first and then go into the breeding?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should touch on it, but I don't think we need to spend a ton of time on it, because we did dedicate a lot of time to the Mbunas. But it's basically the same principles, but with these fish being larger and not necessarily being cave dwellers like Mbunas are, you want to provide them with more open space. A great example, when we're talking about my 2 tanks, which is soon to be 3, newsflash, or spoiler alert, however you want to say it, I'm getting ready to incorporate a third 240-gallon African cichlid tank so that I can have a Mbuna only tank, a peacock only tank, and a hap only tank. But for right now, if you look at my two examples, my Mbuna tank versus my Peacock and Hap tank, there's 3 times as many rocks and caves, and the rocks are basically stacked all the way up in the back for the Mbunas, where I just have maybe a third the volume of rocks in the Peacock and Hap tank. Because they're bigger, I want to allow them to have more open space. Like you said, water parameters exactly like what you would do for Mbunas. But the biggest thing here is the space and the larger tanks. I mean, you can get away with 75-gallon and stuff like that, but if you want to do a Peacock and Hap tank right, you're going to want to give these a 6-foot tank minimum, as large as you can possibly afford, with a lot of open space. I don't really know what more needs to be said about setup, because we covered it pretty extensively with the Mbunas.
Yeah, and if you haven't seen that episode, 100% agree. People ask all the time, "Hey, I'm interested in a peacock tank. I've got a 55-gallon or a 75." And I was like, "No, if you love the African cichlids and especially the fish from Lake Malawi, go Mbuna with those 4-foot tanks.
Yep.
Get a 6-foot tank. Get at least a 125, but like you said, even larger is better, because the peacocks and haps, I truly believe, to manage a peacock slash hap tank and manage the aggression, you need more space. I think that they're actually harder on one another than the Mbuna are, even though a lot of times the really tough Mbuna get a bad rap, and deservedly so. So that large tank is going to give you the space you need to, one, overstock it, just like we talked about with Mbuna. So in a 125, for most peacocks, you could easily get 40 fish in that tank, I would say. Now the haps are a different story, because you got a bunch of Venustus in there. You might not do that, or Lethrinops. Those are a little bit larger, but you have to overstock that tank just like you do in Mbuna, and that means you're going to put a lot of fish in there.
Yeah, when my 3 tanks are done, they're all 3 the same dimensions. They're all 240s. I have right now probably 70 yellow labs in my yellow lab tank. I'll probably end up with somewhere around 50 peacocks when it's all done. I'm not doing it all at one time. But then the hap tank, I'm going to try to grab some of the larger varieties of haps. So things like the Malawi trout and the Christie eye, and the ones that get really big. So I might have 16, maybe 14, 16 in that tank. Same size tank, but those fish are potentially going to get much bigger in the hap tank. So, but if you're going to mix them together, I could not agree with you more. Particularly with haps, you need much more space to allow these fish to achieve what you want them for, which is that full size, all the fins, all the colors. We need more space. We need 125 at the minimum. One of my personal favorites is the 150, the 6-foot 150 with that 30-inch window. Oh, that's so perfect for peacocks and haps. One of my favorites. The 240 is the same, but just exaggerated because it's deeper. And the 240 is my favorite, but a 150 is a more practical, can fit in your living room kind of thing. Absolutely perfect for peacocks or haps or both.
Absolutely. And when you're thinking about setting up that tank, again, sand is a must, because they're gonna go through that sand. They're gonna dig their pits. They're gonna look for food. They're gonna spit the sand out. Do not expect a pristinely aquascaped aquarium. I think that's one thing that a lot of people who keep African cichlids start to realize. They love to dig. They love to spit the sand out. They like to move it around. Make sure when you are putting rocks in that aquarium that they are secure. So when you start stacking rocks, again, just like John said, you're not going to use as many rocks necessarily, because you do want to give them the open space. But for the rocks that you do put in there, make sure that you have a very, very solid foundation, because they do like to dig, especially around structure, and that can cause some things to shift. I don't know about you. I notice in your tank in the background right now, and you do the same thing I do. I really, really, really love a dark background, preferably a black background and dark sand. Although you can get away with lighter sand, but I really want those fish to show maximum color. And unlike the Mbuna are the same color almost regardless of where you put them. The peacocks and the haps, they do a little bit more blending with their surroundings. And so if you can get them on a dark background with a dark substrate, they're going to show the deepest blues and yellows and reds and oranges and give you a lot more color.
100%. I have a very light substrate, like a sand colored sand in my peacock and hap tank, and that's definitely a detriment to their color. There's no doubt about that. When I set up my hap tank, I'm going to be using this same substrate that I have in here, which is just like a natural, it's darker than regular sand, but probably still not dark enough. I agree with you completely. Black background, although that aqua blue background for peacocks and haps looks really good too. Not popular. I mean, most people are like, what? No way. I would never do a blue background. But it does look good with these fish, but nothing compares to the black. And even if you have like a full-size 3D background that covers the entire back, that looks great, but that'll also affect the colors of the fish. So that black background is what gives it that depth and really makes those colors pop. And the right lighting is important too. But yeah, they are definitely affected by their surroundings. There's no doubt about that as far as their colors that they show.
And that's a great point that you brought up because, and I did this, the 75-gallon Mbuna tank that I have to my left, I have the rock background in there. Got one from Aqua Decor. Love it. Looks great. Now there's Mbuna in that tank, but it's a darker gray. So a lot of people love to put those 3D backgrounds in the African cichlid tanks because it really does look pretty darn awesome.
And it's instant.
But I would recommend, you're going to have choices. So whether it's Aqua Decor or what's the other one, Universal Rocks.
Yep.
You have a lot of choices. If it's an African cichlid backdrop, I would opt for the darkest possible choice I can get, but not earth tones. So if doing a rock background, I'm trying to stay away from the tans and the browns, because then you're going to get more fish that just kind of blend. And that's the whole purpose of the African cichlid tank, is to have those fish just pop. They are the star of the aquarium.
Yeah. And I agree with you 100%. I mean, that's absolute fact. However, it's not that the fish are going to look really bad. It's just, you're not getting the full potential. Yeah. You know, you're not putting the 93 octane in it. You know, it's still, I've had it before. Like you said, I've had the Universal Rock full covered background that was like a brownish rock, absolutely gorgeous. The fish still looked great, but they would have looked better if it was the black background. So it's, you know, it's not that you're making a mistake if you use those things, but you will notice a difference. I mean, the black background it really should be standard for peacock and hap tanks, but I understand the appeal, and I too really like the look of those rocky backgrounds, but you do have to understand it's going to impact the color a little bit. It's not going to drain them out completely, but you'll notice a difference.
And while we're on the subject of color, you mentioned this already, but I think it's important to just make sure that we cover it and people hear it a second time. The way in which your tank is stocked is also going to impact the colors of these fish, especially with the peacocks and haps. In Mbuna, it doesn't matter. They're going to be the color that they are. But when you've got, and you mentioned this at the pet store, when you've got a dominant male, that dominant male is going to show all the color. It's going to be in the middle of the aquarium. Its fins are always going to be erect. It's going to be flashing. It's going to be showing off. And everybody else in that tank is going to know it. Now, while the other fish will show color, sometimes they'll be like, hey, I got to mute this down. It's a way that fish communicate a hierarchy. And even if they're a different species, sometimes like, you know what? Yeah, I could just be blasting full of red and blue right now, but I'm going to color down just a little bit out of respect for the big guy there, because I don't need the big guy chasing me around all the time.
I have an example of that right now, right behind me, not immediately behind me, but it's back there. You can't see it right now. I have fluorescent peacocks, which is another one of my favorites. Yellow, primarily yellow, blue face, blue fins. All of the fins are blue, and it's unbelievable. One of the prettiest peacocks. I got these from the Cichlid Shack a while back, and they are breeding like crazy. And I've got the second generation of fish that I've gotten from this batch that are maturing now. And it's funny because there is that dominant male that is a showstopper. He's unbelievable. And the other, it almost looks like, if you look at it from a distance, it's a tank with one male and 30 females. Maybe not 30, but 20 females. but it's not. If you really get in there and look at it, you'll see there's obvious differences between the males and the females. But like you said, the other males are like, oh, he's going to kick my butt if I don't fall in line, so I'm going to dim out here. But you can still tell which ones are males. They're nowhere near as colored up as the alpha male will be. So, but it's easy to tell the difference.
Yeah. Another thing that, again, you kind of mentioned this, but I have been to facilities where, not necessarily pet stores, but every single peacock is absolutely on fire. I mean, they are showing some color that you just could not even imagine. And there are some pet stores when you walk in there and you see these fish and you're like, I have never seen these have to be saltwater. Why, in your opinion, in your professional opinion, do you think when you walk into a pet store and there are 30 ruby reds in there and they're only 2 inches, and every last one of them is fired up beyond belief? Why has that happened?
Because that's what the farms did to trick you into thinking that they're all males. It is an interesting thing. Fish are just like human beings. If you give females male hormones, they can start to show male traits. Just like if you give estrogen to a male, it can start to, develop breasts and all of this kind of stuff. That happens in fish too. They will feed their fish food that has hormones in it to give the females the traits of the males, and they're tricking you. It's false advertisement. They're tricking you into believing that those are all males, and they're charging you top dollar for it. And about 3-4 weeks after you buy that fish, you're going to be very disappointed. You're going to think, oh no, what's happened here? What am I doing wrong? You're not doing anything wrong. The hormones have worn off, and some of them will be males. 50% of them will be males, but the other 50% are going to turn into females, or they've always been, but you know what I mean? They're going to go back to looking like females, and then you're going to be like, oh no, I was duped, because you were charged top dollar for them as if they were males, but they're not. And I really wish this wasn't a thing, but it's definitely a real thing, and it happens. And the biggest thing to look out for, like you said, there is not a male peacock or a female peacock that is going to show full top tier color at 2 inches. It's not going to happen. So if that's the first red flag, if you see them and they're small and they're showing that bright color like that, run. Don't walk, run from that place. Don't give them your money.
And haps especially. Haps, they need some size. And I've kept Red Empress, I've kept the Lethrinops, I've had the Venustus, and they usually maybe 4 or 5 inches. And they're like, oh, is that blue? I'm starting to see, oh, that's so cool. Patience. Not only that, but if you buy these fish that are fully colored up at 2 inches, even your males after 3 or 4 weeks, because again, they weren't supposed to be showing that color at that age anyway. They were just hopped up on drugs. And so what happens is even they color down. Now, here's the other interesting part is when they're injected with all these hormones, a couple things happen. One, they may never color up the same way again. And two, the females, pretty much, you might have destroyed their ability to reproduce. And so now you're not even getting the advantage of the females that are supposed to be able, okay, well, at least I've got a pair, I can make more. If you inject them full of these drugs early on, it can mess up their ability to reproduce. And obviously, it's going to have health impacts. When you're injecting hormones that are not supposed to be in an organism, especially early on, it is absolutely always, without fail, going to have physiological problems later on.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the haps taking longer. That is definitely true. Some of them even more than others. I mean, the Malawi trout, which for whatever reason, I'm not a professional. The scientific name escapes me right now. But I deal in common names anyway, because I'm just a person. But the Malawi trout is one of the most elusive fish to get a male of, because that fish can be 1.5 years old before it actually starts to blossom into, and I don't know if it's a puberty thing or I don't know, but that fish can take a very long time before it starts to show color. So with some of these selective haps, like your Buccochromis, even your Alis and things like that, the Friar Eye and the Venusis, it's really good idea to talk to somebody that is very fluent with this. All due respect to your normal fish store owner, they might not have the knowledge to be able to determine that's definitely a male, that's definitely a female. Jason, I've bought in my 30 years 6 or 8 Malawi trouts as males, and they all turned out to be females.
That's disappointing. So it's, by the way, it's Champsachromis caeruleus is the.
Thank you. Jeez.
I couldn't remember either.
I appreciate that.
It was driving me crazy. If I remember, I was at a pet store in, I think it was at one of the OCAs where we did like a pet store tour. So I'm pretty sure it was in Cleveland, and they had a bunch of tanks in their basement. And I went down there. I'm like, can I film down here? And they were like, yeah, that's fine. Just don't show too much. But it was because they had the most beautiful Malawi trout I have ever. I mean, it was one of the most beautiful cichlids I've ever seen in my life. And I just sat there. So in one of my videos somewhere out there, I have absolutely one of the best African cichlids I've ever seen. And now I can't remember for the life of me where that was.
I have a very similar story. In fact, I have footage of it also, and I've used it in several videos. I was at a store called London Town Tropicals up in North Maryland, about a half an hour from BWI Airport, and they had a lot of fish, but they had one tank that was like a 40-gallon, and all it had in it was one trout, and it was easily a foot long, and fully blazing colors. And I was like, oh, that's my dream come true. But I wasn't set up at the time to do anything with it. I couldn't take it home with me. And the guy at the store, they were selling this fish for $250. And the guy at the store was like, yeah, I mean, that fish is probably worth way more than that. But, people are shocked when they see the price. I said, listen, dude, if I could take that fish right now, I'd pay you $1,000 for that fish. Yeah. Because that is so elusive to find that. I mean, you just don't find it. Farms don't want to raise these fish for 2 years to get them to that size. They want to be able to get them big enough to identify and then ship them out. And so that's a really, really difficult one to get a male version of. I personally will be purchasing one from Ron's Cichlids. I'm giving them a free plug right now because they deserve it. I was at their facility. They kind of specialize in Champsachromis. And Hunter, the guy that does primarily the most of the work in there, we went to a champ tank is what I call them. Thank you for reminding me of what they're called. And he had like 60 of them in there. And Hunter was looking in and he was like, yeah, that's a male, that's a male, that's a male. He knew. And these were 3-4 inches long. So that's where I'm going to be getting mine from. And I was like, save me a nice one for when I'm ready. But that's been that fish that I've been after for so long, because I know I said this about the Lethrinops, but because they're so hard to find and it's so rare, that is probably my most sought after fish personally, that I would consider my holy grail African cichlid is that the full potential trout is, I think Ben Ochart has one, and I get so jealous every time I see it because I'm like, I can't do that.
And the other thing too is to find some of these large haps with perfect fins. And that's what this was on this video that I showed, because let's face it, one of two things often happens, especially for those of us who keep peacocks and haps. One, they get the snot kicked out of them. And so they they just look like, hey, you know what? I've been in a tank all my life and I got to fight for my spot. Or two, something happens, right? I mean, when you're keeping fish, especially cichlids, for years upon years upon years, and you've got this aquarium, you're undoubtedly going to add a fish that brings in a disease, or somebody's going to jump, or someone's going to lose some marbles and wind up killing off half your tank. And so it's really unusual. Like when I had that Lethrinops, or, I know you had a beautiful Lethrinops as well, or these large Malawi trout, when you get one that's 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, and it is in full display, and it is the king of the tank, and it's got perfect fins with perfect color, it's like a unicorn.
It is. It really. That's why I said Holy Grail. I mean, it is. It really is. And there's a lot of them that are that way. The Malawi hawk is another one that is very, very hard to get that really good example of. Again, I don't like calling them specimens. But that's part of the fun, isn't it? I mean, it's almost like chasing that antique. You know, and I love antiques. I don't know about you, but it's part of the fun to explore and try to find that. And I'm trying to stop my cat from eating my power wires. That's part of the fun of it. And nothing would be worse than to finally find one and put it in. It gets the butt kicked, his butt kicked, and all of a sudden it's like, oh no. But that is something, I'm glad you brought it up. It is the risk you take with these fish. There will always be bickering. There will always be chasing. People freak out at first because they're like, my fish are chasing each other around. And I have to calm them down and say, yeah, that's what African cichlids do. Get used to it. Yep. Now, when there starts to be a lot of damage, then we might need to take things to another level. But they're always going to chase each other around. They do that. It's part of the fun. You know, yep. I'm watching it happen right now as we're talking. I mean, it's what they do. And as long as they're not killing each other, then it's nothing to really worry about.
And I would love to hear from people who are watching this in the comments section. What is the fish that you find most rewarding to grow over its lifetime? Because I love the nanofish. We have a bazillion nanofish. The tanks behind me, there's tons of them, but they look the same when they're born for the most part. They die basically looking the same. They grow to be about an inch. But the most rewarding fish that I've ever kept in my life are the fish that I get when they're really small. And especially the haps, because they can take 3, 4, or 5 years before they're actually showing their potential. Mm-hmm. And the geophagus. The geophagus are the South American cichlids, where it's the same thing. You get them when they're small and they look okay, but it's when you see that perfect geophagus that's 10 inches and it has those long fin trailers. But the haps are the same way. They are some of the most rewarding fish that you can keep because, there's other big fish. Like you've got the Oscars behind you, but those Oscars looked exactly the same as they did when they were 1 inch. They're just bigger now, right? These yep. fish transform, and it is absolutely an accomplishment when you keep them and you get them and people walk into your home and they're like, what is that? And you're like, that took me 8 years to get this to look this way.
Yeah. And most African cichlid keepers will go years to be able to get that together. And I hate to say it, but they'll spend a lot of money and they'll go through a lot of fish, because what you run into, you get to a point where if you have a 200-gallon tank, let's say, and you've got 12 haps in there and 12 peacocks, well, those are going to be some pretty big fish. You can't go buy 2-inch fish. It's not going to work. I can tell you a nightmare story about that, and it ends exactly how you think it ends. You have to get larger fish. Larger fish cost more money. Of course, you're going to want to get males, so you're basically spending top dollar. And for peacocks, I would say top dollar for a fully colored male 4 inches, easily $80, $85 from a reputable breeder or a fish store. Wouldn't even be surprised to hear them being a little more than that. Haps, though, if you find that holy grail big, 12-inch, like I said, $250, $300 for that champ, it can be a lot of money. But you have to do that because you can't, unless you have another tank that you can put them in to let them grow out, which a lot of African cichlid keepers have, grow out tanks. Bill Mason, friend of mine up in Connecticut, he's got that, where he's got 4 African cichlid tanks that are all 250 gallons or bigger. And he's got another tank that's completely separate that he uses to grow fish up to be appropriately sized to blend in with all of the others. You can spend a lot of money on these. And that's where it kind of gets into that saltwater territory where, saltwater fish, it's not uncommon to go in and see a saltwater fish that's $300. That's not unusual in a saltwater fish store. Same thing with these. $300 is a stretch for Africans, but you find the right one. You find that Malawi hawk or that trout or a fully colored up Venustus. Venustus are a lot more common, but you're going to spend big money for those. You just have to know that. And it's one of the unfortunate things about it. I wish we could all just buy little fish and let them grow up, but you can do that in the beginning. But once you get to a certain point, you're just doomed if you do that.
You're 100% right. And that brings up a few points that popped into my head. Point number 1 is you have to quarantine these fish. If you've got an existing Peacocks tank, if you're setting one up now and you're like, all right, I'm going to put my fish in there. Great. A year from now, You throw a fish in there that brings in ick or brings in a bacterial infection, and you wipe out what is now going to cost you $1,000 to replace all those fish. It's the dumbest thing you can do. So you're going to need a quarantine tank. And if you're going to be buying these larger fish, a 10 gallons probably not going to do. You might need a 20 or a 29 or even a 40 breeder. If you're going to be growing out these fish like John was just talking about, that's usually a 55 gallon, because you're going to stunt the growth of these fish if you try to throw, I'm going to grow it up in a 20. No, you're not. That fish is not going to grow in a 20 gallon. You're going to need a 4-foot tank just to grow these fish out to get them into that full display tank. And then here's the best part of all this. Sounds like I'm trying to talk people out of this. You're going to put that beautiful fish in there that you might have spent 80 to $100 on, and you have no guarantee whatsoever that these fish are going to get along. Your new fish might just destroy half the fish in that tank, or even worse, and what is more common is all these other fish are like, yeah, you know what? No, we had our stuff worked out. You're not coming in here and messing with that. And
Right.
you might have 3 or 4 fish immediately attack that fish, and there's nothing you can do about it.
You're absolutely right, but there is something you can do. You're absolutely right. If you put one fish in there and that fish gets attacked, you okay?
Yeah, I bumped my cup.
There's
Sorry.
nothing you can do to stop that. You're 100% right. So what I would recommend to anyone, and again, this is big money, and that's, part of the deal when we're talking about these fish, add them in groups.
There you go.
Do not put one in at a time. Add them in groups. If you have a 240 gallon tank, I would say 4 to 5. But if it's a smaller tank, at least 3, because what that does is it disperses the fish's attention. Now they're like, oh, well, that's a new guy over there too. Wait, there's also another new guy. They're not going to all hone in on that one new guy. And I refer to them as guys because we're at that point probably buying all males. Add them in groups, as many as you can, because then they're not going to just have that one fish to focus on, and they will focus on that one fish. And like Jason said, ain't nothing you can do to stop it, but pull it out, put it back in the hospital tank, go buy a couple more, quarantine those, and then add them all in at the same time. Another trick that I have found to be very effective. This is a lot of work, but you can do it, especially with big fish. It's a huge pain in the butt. Get you one of those big giant totes, pull all the fish out, and do, while you're at it, do your maintenance and maybe redecorate things a little bit, move things around, and then put all of the fish, including the new ones, in at the same time. And now it's a new space for everybody. And now they have to start over again of finding their hierarchy. This can go badly because while they're all falling in line and figuring out who's boss, this is where things can get dicey. So it could go badly and you end up, hating me because you're taking this advice. But usually they'll all go in there and they're all like, oh, okay, this is all brand new. They're not even paying attention to the fact that there's new guys being added in with them because everything's new to them. And in my experience, that's worked out really well to do that. But again, African cichlids picking out their pecking order is always a roll of the dice. You never know how it's going to go. Usually with all males, them not having females to fight over, it's a little easier, but they have to fall in line. And if they don't, you could be in trouble. So none of this is guaranteed to give you success.
Those are excellent pieces of advice. The other thing that I've done that has worked for me in the past is especially with the cichlids, if I'm going to be adding, let's say that 4 to 6, and you're right, I almost never add just one. If I'm adding a group of 4 to 6, I'll do it with the lights off. And so the lights are off. I add, and I know there's 2 different thoughts with this. This is what's worked for me. I put them in there with the lights off, and the lights come back on later in the day. They get fed. And so hopefully the fish are initially focusing on the food. Now their bellies are full. They're not usually going to be as aggressive. I mean, how many of us are aggressive with a belly full of food? Like, oh, I just had a whole pizza. Let me go start a fight. That's usually not what's going to happen. So give them some food. Let them, lights come on. You can't feed them right when the lights come on. They're still sleeping, but let them wake up for a second. Here's some food. They're distracted. Everybody ate. It just allows them to get used to what's going on. But the reconstructing the tank and pulling them all out is an even better option.
It's a lot of work, but it works. And I'll tell you my nightmare story. I'm actually quite embarrassed by this. When I had my fish store, I got in a shipment of fish from Florida Exotic Fish Sales, my opinion, the best producer of African cichlids on the planet, other than Lake Malawi. And we got the shipment in, and we had a regular customer in the store that was a personal friend, had become a personal friend because of the store. His name's David Burrell. He was in there, and he had his eye on this one albino peacock that was just a breathtaking fish, absolutely gorgeous. And I was messing with him because I was like, I'm not selling you that one. I mean, we just got it. It just came in. I just took it out of the bag. And so I can't sell it to you right now, but, you know. And so we start going back and forth, and he starts talking trash, and we're doing what guys do. And I said, all right, hotshot, you want to see what the biggest benefit of having your own fish store is? Let me show you. And I took that fish, put him in a net. I took him over to my 240-gallon African cichlid tank with all fully mature fish in there. And I plopped him in there. One fish by himself.
Oh, no.
And I'm like, that is the benefit of having your own fish store. And then I walked back and I went back to work. David came to me 30 seconds later. He said, yeah, John, that didn't work out too well for you. I said, what do you mean? Jason, I'm not making this up. I go back to the tank. My biggest venustus, which I had named Vinny, had the tail of that albino sticking out of his mouth. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. I've never been more humiliated. I've never been more like ashamed. Like, I just killed that fish. And it's my fault that happened. It was a horrible, horrible thing. He laughed it off like, yeah, that's a real benefit to having a fish store. But that was a huge nightmare. And that brings me to another thing. The reason why this happened is, first of all, I was cocky and thought I would show off in front of my friend. But also, you don't realize how big your fish are until you put smaller fish in with them. And then it's like, whoa, you've been looking at these fish every day. And so to you, they don't look much different than when you got them. But then you put that little 2.5-inch fish in and you realize, oh, I just put a baby in there in a tank full of lions. It's a huge mistake. So yeah, don't be like me and feed your venustus fish that you could have sold for $30 a piece.
And I'd love to hear from people in the comments, because I've done this a million times. You go to a pet store, you buy fish, you think that they are going to be an awesome addition to your aquarium, you quarantine them, but then even after that 4 weeks, you're like, this isn't going to work. These fish are way too small. How many of you have done that before? Because it's actually pretty darn common. You don't realize the size difference. Oh, yeah. You know, the other thing we have to talk about too is filtration. We're talking about huge tanks that are overstocked with big fish, bigger than the Mbuna, bigger appetites. They're going to eat a lot more. And now we're talking, hey, let's just go bare bones 125. What are you throwing on that tank?
There's no better rule than to double the filtration for your tank, in my opinion, which would be filter it as if it's double the size. So filter it for a 250-gallon tank, which is more. I'm sorry, Fluval, but that's more than an FX6. I mean, I would put more than just an FX. The FX6 is kind of the staple big tank canister filter, you know, and I get it. It's the best filter out there. But I think you need even more than that on a tank that size. Filter it big time, because this is a tank you're going to struggle with, just like the Mbuna tank. You know, you said it earlier, don't expect your tank to be perfect, because it's never going to be, because these are dirty fish. They're messy. But that's why we love them. It's never going to be perfect. So over filtering it is absolutely critical. My 3 tanks, I'm getting ready to add filtration to all 3 of them. The one is currently saltwater, but when I convert it to freshwater, it's going to have a full sump, which is appropriate for a 240, plus 2 Cichlids whale 500s. And then my 2 existing 240s that I have Africans in now have the Custom Aquarium seamless sump system, which is superb. I'm going to be adding a canister whale, a Cichlids whale 500 to each of those too. And they're basically going to be full of Fritz Max Out and sponges. That's all that's going to be in those canisters, just to provide that extra mechanical filtration and the biofiltration or the chemical filtration with the Max Out, because Over filtering is the rule when it comes to these. And big flow. They love a lot of flow.
Yeah, 100% agree. So in my 75-gallon Mbuna tank, I think I've got probably close to 20 Mbuna. I'm running a Fluval 407. It is doing an outstanding job. I have to maintain that thing and just make sure that I get the sponges and all that stuff cleaned out probably every couple of months, every 8 weeks or so. Otherwise, it just stops collecting the stuff. At a 125, I'd be okay with a FX6 with a Peacock tank, but you are going to be maintaining that thing because it is going to get clogged up. Understand, when we're talking about filtration, the biological filtration, you could throw 3 sponge filters in there and biologically you're fine. You are, if you've got those ATI hydros in there, I wouldn't hesitate if it was just a biological filtration issue. If I had 3 fully cycled Hydro 5 sponge filters, way more than I'm ever going to need for biological. The problem is, like you said, these fish, they love to spit out sand. They love to go through the substrate and kind of do their digging. They stir up a lot of stuff, which is actually nice because the substrate stays relatively clean because they're always stirring stuff up. And
Yep.
if you've got a canister filter that's sucking it all up, it's great. But it's the mechanical filtration. You have to have something in there that is going to trap all of the stuff that they dig up, all the fish waste and all the detritus and everything. And with 3 sponge filters, while you're fine biologically, I promise you, your tank would look horrible. It would look unappealing. The water would be fine. There'd be no ammonia. There'd be no nitrite. You're doing your water changes. You'd keep your nitrate in check, but you'd be like, man, there's just stuff floating around everywhere. It looked terrible. So that's why you need the big filtration. It's really for the mechanical side of it.
Yeah, and I don't know. I thought I said a 240 and FX6 is not enough. Did I say a 125? Because I completely agree with you. An FX6 on a 125 is appropriate. Absolutely. It'd be perfect.
Oh, but 240, yeah, for sure. You might be struggling
240,
there.
you're pushing it. Yeah, I mean, you might be okay for a little bit, but once they start to mature, yeah, you're going to struggle with that. And the ATI sponge filter is the best in the business, but it even can't keep up with those. I mean, when you look at the farms, and that's a great way when you're starting to think about what kind of filtration should I get, look at the farms and look at what they're doing. They have these massive vats that have 1,000 gallons in them, and there's 300 fish in there, no decor at all, just an open tub. But the amount of water that's going in and coming out of there is like a geyser. I mean, it's a huge flow. Like they have to turn it off because they can't see in the tank because there's so much flow. They can't see the fish to be able to pick them out. So, you know, they like a lot of water movement, and they like that water to be processing really, really fast. And we as fish keepers like it too because our tank doesn't look like trash all the time.
And the other thing too is, and I just did a video on oxygen and whether or not your fish are getting enough oxygen. And when you've got those filters that create a little bit more flow, like the FX6 and a 125, you're getting a lot more surface agitation because again, you've got big eaters with a big metabolism. They're sucking out a lot of oxygen out of that water. And so when you've got a lot of surface agitation that these big filters produce, you're going to be ensured that you've got enough O2 in the tank and that the CO2 is gassing off properly. And again, if you had 3 Hydro 5s, they would create a lot of surface agitation too, but the mechanical would just be horrible. But you do want some flow in there because if the water is stagnant, you're going to have some big problems with those fish. They are going to be struggling for oxygen.
100%. Could not agree more. And the good thing about that is if your tank in a overstocked Peacock and Hap tank or Mbuna tank, if your tank is low on oxygen, your fish are going to tell you really fast.
Yeah.
I mean, it is like there's no fish that screams for help better than African cichlids do because they'll go up to the top. They'll be gasping for air. All fish do that, but African cichlids, maybe they're just a bunch of pansies or something. I don't know, but it's because they're waste producers. They're big and there's so many of them in the tank. If the oxygen gets depleted, they start to suffer really fast. And so they start to show you, hey, we got a problem in here. You better get off your butt and stop watching YouTube videos and come fix this problem. They'll tell you really, really fast. Something we haven't talked about yet, though, and I want to get your opinion on because everybody knows what I'm going to say. What are you feeding peacocks and haps?
Great question. So again, you and I, we kind of feed some of the same stuff. It's a North Fin thing. That's the only thing we feed in our fish room. So I give them a variety. And they're unlike the Mbuna. They don't need quite as much vegetable matter as the Mbuna do. I'm not as concerned about bloat, but for me, I really like, there's a few things. The tropical food sticks, because again, I'm setting up levels. So fish that want to eat from the surface, they can eat the tropical food sticks. They've got cichlid pellets that I really like. And the kelp wafers, they will eat those things. They also like the veggie pellet as well. And I will put flakes in there because some of their flakes are larger, the krill flakes, the kelp flakes, the community flakes, the cichlid flakes. I just rotate that stuff. I don't do for any of my fish a lot of bloodworms, because I think frozen bloodworms, especially when I was feeding those more often, I just seem to be having more fish with more digestive issues. So I kind of stay away from that. Uh, I just generally don't do a lot of frozen foods. That's pretty much what I feed.
Pretty almost close, exact to what I do too. I mean, I am definitely a North Fin guy. I'm also an extreme guy. So I also incorporate the cichlid peewee for the Mbunas and the big fella for the peacocks and haps. That's the food that all of my Mbunas were raised on, that food. That was their staple at the farm and everything else. But I do incorporate, I'm sitting here looking at all of the foods because they're just sitting right there on top of the tank. The and Lisa does this mostly, but the Bug Pro, the kelp and community flakes, or excuse me, the kelp and krill flakes, the veggie and the cichlid pellets, mixed in with the extreme. And then I'm also testing out the Vitalis. I
Nice.
have a large bucket of the large carnivore pellets, and they absolutely gobble those right up. One of the most unique fish foods I've ever used because it's soft, and that's
Okay.
it's just unusual. Like
Yeah.
you typically see that. We're entertaining picking it up. We're testing it out right now to see if our fish like it. And when I say pick it up, I mean to carry it on our
Sure.
website. But the biggest piece of advice that I would give to people for fish foods, yes, Jason and I have our preferred brands. But the cool thing is with African cichlids, they're such a popular part of this hobby that almost every brand makes a food specific for those fish.
Yeah.
So it's not hard to find. Typically, when you see a pellet advertised as cichlid, that's almost always going to be formulated for African cichlids. You'll see a different name for your South Americans and things like that. You can feed those the cichlid pellets too,
Sure.
but they're making that basically for African cichlids. And there's so many different kinds of foods that'll bring out the red colors, and foods that are the primary source of protein is going to be krill. That's going to help with red anyway, but it's not hard to find food for your African cichlids. And the best thing about it, these daggone fish will eat anything. You can put anything in there and they'll eat it. Like you, I stay away from frozen foods, not because they're not good, but because, for one, my wife is allergic to bloodworms, and two, I just have too many. Like, I would have to feed an entire pack of the Hikari bloodworms in order to satiate all of my peacocks and haps, because each one of them would take like their own entire cube. No, I'm not going to mess with that. It's too much.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. One thing we haven't covered, and I do think it's important, and that is lighting for your African cichlid tanks, because these are fish that have insanely nice color. Now, there's two different ways you could look at it. They have insanely nice color, and you're not going to keep plant. That's something we didn't really mention, but you're not keeping plants with these fish if we haven't already made that clear, because they're going to eat the plants. So you're not using the lighting to grow plants, but you're going to have to think about the lighting and how you want the fish to look. I personally think on an African cichlid tank, I don't want warm color lighting. I don't really like warm color lighting on most of my aquariums,
Me
but
neither.
the cooler lighting is, the cooler color spectrums are usually better for the African cichlid tanks. And I especially love the ability to dial that in. So, like, for instance, on my Mbuna tank over here with the Yellow Labs, all of these tanks here, I've got these aqua illumination lights. But what's cool about them, and it's not just them, other lights do this too, you can adjust the color spectrum and the intensity. And that, I think, gets overlooked with a lot of African cichlid tanks. If you think your fish look cool and you've got a $20 light on there, don't change anything, first of all.
Right.
However, I can promise you that if you had the ability to change the color spectrum, if you think your fish look cool now, you would not believe their full potential once you have them in a light that maximizes their color.
100%. And me in particular, I like to turn up the red because it just makes the fish pop. It completely changes the look of the entire tank. I'm not saying that it looks like a red tank. I'm just saying turning up the red slightly, because you're usually able to adjust your red, green, blue. Turning up the blue makes it look like a saltwater tank, but and then a lot of times you can just turn all three of them up at the same time, and that's going to enhance it too. But the cool thing about it is you can just play with it until you find that sweet spot that you like the most. But I agree with you totally. Warm colors, they just, no, I'm not into it when it comes to African cichlids. This is something where you're lighting, you're almost going to want it closer to what saltwater people do. The light that accentuates all of those colors, because you're not concerned about growing plants and all that kind of stuff. And at the end of the day, like we said with the mbunas, the lights are for you. Right. They're not for the fish. They do not care. So you want it to look as good as you can get it to look. And I do have my preferences. You like the apertures. Those are great. Kessels and apertures are kind of at the same level. They're kind of like the best in the business. But get what you can afford, what you think looks good. But I agree. Try to get a light. It's going to cost you more money that has the adjustability of that color spectrum, because you're going to want to really show these fish.
And the cool thing is, unlike some fish where if the lights are too bright, they start to hide, African cichlids and the peacocks and haps, just like the mbuna, my gosh, they are not shy. They are the fish that are up in your face. They know when you're there. They're going to interact with you. They're going to interact with one another. It's why people get cichlids in the first place, because they want that little extra thing. The thing that's not going to be found in tetras. I love tetras. I got a whole fish room filled with tetras and rasboras and barbs. But the cichlids, and especially those African cichlids, they lose their minds when it's time to eat, like you've already mentioned. They're excited to see you. They recognize you. And if you sit back and watch those aquariums, you will know each fish's individual personality, how they're going to act. You can predict what they're going to do in certain situations. You're going to know what part of the tank they like. You're going to know what structures they feel comfortable around. As a quick story, not African cichlids. I had a Pseudotropheus acei, which is a large mbuna, and I had a species 44, which is a Lake Victorian fish. And did you know, for years, they were both males, by the way, that Pseudotropheus would follow around that species 44 all over the tank. Followed constantly. I'm like, this fish has got to be getting so sick of this other one. And he was fine with it. These are aggressive. That species 44 is no joke. That's an aggressive fish. Here's the crazy thing. They would swim around. And at one point, I introduced an OB. Biggest mistake I ever made in this 150. That OB was a jerk. Only time I ever had to remove a fish out of that tank. He tried to attack the Pseudotropheus. I'm not making this up. That species 44 ripped him a new one, and then they just swam around the tank again together. And I had to get rid of that OB because now it was trying to go after both of them. They were both like, no, man, it's game on. It's the dumbest thing I've ever seen, but it was so cute. And that's what African cichlids do sometimes.
I talked about it in the mbuna video, and I'll talk about it again. It is the interaction that you get with these fish, like you said, is second to none. There's no other fish in this hobby that creates the amount of chaos that these fish do when you walk up to the tank. In fact, I'll tell you a fun story. When we had our shop, we had a regular customer that came in, and she would come early in the morning when we opened, and she would open up the door and she would look in and she would say, "John, are we okay?" And I would say, "Yep, go ahead." She had a little son that was like 4, and he was autistic. And when you came into my store, if you turned an immediate right, you would see our 8-foot long, 240-gallon tank. And so she would ask me, "Is it okay?" I would say yes. She would let him in. He would run directly for that tank, and he would just start running back and forth with his hand up on the tank, and the fish would follow him back and forth. And it made him so happy. She looked forward to this for him. It was amazing to watch. And if I had been a better YouTuber at the time, I would have gotten footage of this, because it was incredible to watch. And the smile on that kid's face, just watching the fish follow him back and forth, was priceless. And an Oscar's not going to do that. Tetras are not going to do that. but these fish will, and they'll go to the top and splash all over it when you're ready to feed them. It is one of the most fun things that you're going to experience with these fish. And I've never seen an African cichlid tank that doesn't do it. Every single one of them does it. You walk up to the tank and they go absolutely nuts, wagging their tails like dogs when you're going to feed them. And that is one of the best parts about these fish.
And I know we're running up against time, but there's one last thing that I can think of, and maybe you've got some other things, but that we haven't really discussed. People ask all the time, tank mates. And what they mean by that is usually non-African cichlid fish. Can they go in with your peacocks and your haps? Now, for me, there's generally only a couple that I can think of that I do, and more so from necessity, not because I really want to see fish in with my peacocks and my haps. I have been very successful putting bristlenose plecos in my peacock and hap tanks just to take care of algae and stuff like that on the glass. They do that wonderfully. The only other one that adds a different kind of perspective that I think fits in, that has fit in okay with me, are the Synodontis catfish, because they're not necessarily Malawi, but they seem to do pretty well with the peacocks and the haps, although it's not guaranteed. Some of them get pretty darn big, as you know, 8-9 inches. Mm-hmm. Dwarf, maybe not the best for the haps because they're only going to get 3 to 4 inches. I don't know if you even agree with that statement, but any thoughts?
I don't disagree with that at all. But when people ask me, my response is, why would you want to? Yeah. I mean, for necessity purposes, like you said, I completely agree with the plecos. I don't necessarily go bristlenose. I would go more like royals, commons, vampires, the bigger ones. I have a vampire in mine now. Haven't seen him in 2 years. Hope he's still alive because they're just always in the back or whatever. But to keep them in there to help, with going around cleaning diatom off the rocks and stuff like that. But other than the more common plecos, why? What do you need more fish in there? If you need blue, go get another blue African cichlid. Like, don't put him in by himself. Make sure you add him in groups. But it's what do you need other fish in there for? But if you are going to add them, I do agree. Synodontis are really good. Bristlenose, I would say for imbunas, maybe not so much peacocks and haps, but then again, I've just never done it, so that's why I say that. But you're going to have so much fun with this tank, you're not necessarily going to need to add anything else to it. I mean, you're going to get enough excitement and energy and all of that. You'll be fine. Just go get some more Africans.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. For the most part, just keep it a African peacock hap tank.
And yeah, we are way over on time, so we don't necessarily need to touch on breeding. We did talk about it with imbunas, I think.
Yeah, and it is pretty straightforward. For me, if I'm breeding the peacocks and haps, I usually just want one male. I know that the traditional wisdom is, one male, a couple females. I like to do one male, 4 or 5 females. And usually it's just a breeding tank only. I'm not trying to breed these things in a community because you can't always guarantee that the fish that you haven't hybridized. So for the peacocks, I'm good with a 40 breeder. That's plenty of space. The haps might need a little bit more space, especially if they're full grown, maybe a 55 gallon, but species only, one male, 4 or 5 females. You see the females holding. Generally what I do is I pull the female out, throw her in a 10 gallon or a 20, depending on the size of the female. Let her sit there because they're going to be super stressed out. They can't protect themselves. They're not going to be eating anyway. I leave her in there, let her spit out her fry, and then I feed the fry and her for a couple weeks. Let her put some weight back on. Back in the breeding tank she goes.
Nothing more needs to be said about it. I mean, that is perfect. If you don't have that breeding tank, if you can just let them do what they do and let nature. Now, if you're setting up a 40-gallon breeder specifically to breed them, you're not going to just let nature take its course, because it won't. The nature taking its course will mean the fry are going to get eaten by all of the other fish in the tank. So, but if you have a community tank, community African cichlid tank, a bunch of fish in there, and you want to just see what happens, like I've done with my yellow labs, there you go. But if you want to breed them, yes, pulling that female out. If you don't have the ability to pull the female out, you can pull the female out after she's been holding for a week or so, strip the eggs out, put them in an egg tumbler, or let her go almost full term to where she has full swimming fry in her mouth, strip those out, put them in a little breeder box up in the corner, but you still have to figure out somewhere to raise those fry. You're not going to raise them in a breeder box. But yeah, I mean, you're either going to do this on purpose, and if you're going to do it on purpose, you're going to set up for it, meaning multiple tanks, or if you're just going to let nature take its course, just let whatever happens happen.
And like we've talked about, understand, if you breed these fish on purpose, you're going to have a whole mess load of females that you're either going to have to sell as a group, like, hey, here's 6 or 8 juvenile fish. We don't know which ones are males, which ones are females. You're going to get almost no money for that because people don't know what they're getting. Or you're going to start selling males off, and you're going to have to figure out what to do with the females. Sometimes you got people who want to breed just like you did. Like, hey, I want that male and 5 or 6 females. Well, then problem solved. But it's going to be...
One of my favorite customers at our fish store would always come in and buy females. Not because he was breeding, but because they were cheap and because I would give him a deal on them. And he liked them. I mean, he didn't mind that they were just brown and silver. I would give them to him for half price. And he loved it. I mean, and so he was one of my favorites.
Nice. Well, I think we should ask the question, do people want a part 3? We didn't even touch on the Lake Tanganyikans, and that is a whole separate, completely separate topic. Lake Tanganyika cichlids, super popular everywhere from your shell dwellers that are an inch that can be kept in a 20-gallon to your frontosa, which needs something like what you've got behind you, a 240 or larger, that are going to be massive and look awesome. So let us know, because this is why we're doing part 2, because so many of you said, hey, where is part 2? If you want Lake Tanganyika, leave that in the comments section below as well.
And if you want an episode specifically on breeding where we're not buzzing through it in all of 2 minutes, I have a lot of experience in that. You have a lot of experience in it. We can easily do an entire episode on breeding African cichlids, not breeding fish in general, but specifically African cichlids. I'd be happy to talk about that. I love talking about that. Yeah. So yeah, definitely let us know.
Awesome. Well, as always, everybody, thank you. Thank you for being here. I'm John. I'm really, really glad to have you back, man. So
glad to be back.
Thanks for being here, everybody. We're going to be back same time, same place next week. Hope you all have a great week.